Ladies and gentlemen. Well, discussion with Agent Smith is about to begin. Hello? 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 Did you press the mute button on your microphone? Okay, restarting Discord. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand by as we sort out these technical difficulties.
Can you hear me?
Yes, but I'm dancing.
Oh, there you are.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Oh, cool. It worked.
It worked! Using the ancient technique of turn it off and turn it back on again. Agent Smith with the big brain plays.
Yeah, that's kind of been the theme with our recording technology the past couple months.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to want to cooperate.
Well, how are you doing?
I'm hanging in there.
Yeah.
How are you doing?
It's a victorious day. We beat Classic WoW. We got the last 2 bosses this weekend.
Ah, cool. Congratulations.
Thanks. It feels like a big achievement and also a big relief for me as the main tank and guild leader that we were able to show everybody all the content.
Nice. The last time we talked about it, I think you mentioned that there was... The next step was you were going to do it again, or what was that?
There's Burning Crusade, which is the first expansion that was added. We don't have a date for that yet. Probably summer that'll come out.
Gotcha. Are you going to do it in the meantime, or are you going to take a break from it?
Well, I'll be continuing to tank. Basically, now that we can kill the last 2 bosses, they drop the most amazing treasure, weapons, and armor, and that kind of thing. So people are keen to down those bosses more times. There are some people who might retire after killing this last boss, but I don't know of anyone in our guild who's going to do that, because it's kind of like you work this hard to get to this point, and now you're going to have access to the sick loot from these bosses. So a lot of people will want to keep blapping them. And as we improve and as we gear up, we can kill the bosses faster and faster. So the hardest part of the raiding process is over, and now we're more in the collecting your spoils of war territory.
Nice. Oh, cool. You guys seemed pretty excited about that when you were talking about it earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very big operation having this many people involved, and I was pretty moved thinking about how many people have followed me on this journey and that kind of thing. And the last bosses are not easy. You have to do a lot of preparation. It takes many, many hours just to be prepared to have a shot at downing the bosses. And then on top of that, you have to not mess it up too much. And this was a really stressful weekend because many of us had the feeling that I think we can do it if we don't fuck up too much. But that if we don't fuck up too much is a pretty big if. There are a lot of things
Yeah.
that could go wrong that just cause certain people to make mistakes and wipe us, and then we don't have enough time to get the bosses down. But we made some mistakes, but not too many mistakes, and we were able to finish it off. And we even did it in a kind of badass way that we didn't expect to, and beating the last boss without getting all those fancy world buffs, which can boost your characters to be really, really strong. We were just walking in there with buffs the first time, and then we die, and you don't get them again until you go back to town. And we were able to take out the boss on the third attempt today, which was pretty badass. So I'm really proud of the team, very excited, very relieved. And yeah, now we're doing some world discussion.
Cool. Yeah, sorry I missed your message earlier. I don't know why I didn't pick up on it. Normally my phone kind of buzzes at me if I don't see a text message, but I don't know.
All good.
So my apologies. Well, I don't know how much of the world news you've been following. Is there anything you've kind of seen that piqued your interest?
Putin, dude.
Putin?
Yeah. Didn't he do a bunch of stuff? He did a ban on gay marriage and also did something else, and who knows where Navalny is now?
Well, Navalny is in a what would you call it? It's basically just a prison, but it's sort of way out in Siberia, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of more of a camp than a prison, so it's a little bit sparse. And the reports that we're getting about him and his condition is that it's deteriorating. He was saying that his hands and feet were going numb. He's also been on a hunger strike because he doesn't think he's getting the care that he needs.
Mm-hmm.
He's still kind of recovering from that whole, nerve toxin poisoning.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not in the best shape. But
Oh.
yeah, there was a ban on, I think, gay marriage. I don't remember reading the details. I didn't pay too much attention to it because that's pretty much just standard boilerplate red meat to the base type stuff. Just kind of passing it for the sake of passing it. I don't know that there's any big impact, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, basically the way I would read into it as the people who didn't like him already, this would make them mad, but he's doing this to please the people who do like him. So pandering to his base, more or less.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. It's not. I mean, it really wasn't legal anyway, and it wasn't really, broadly acceptable because Russian society is pretty conservative. So people are kind of down on that in any case. And like you say, he is still broadly popular. His popularity rating is still pretty good. But it's been in decline, the past couple years, and the United Russia Party definitely is not the most popular at this point. So I think they kind of just wanted to try to do something to kind of stem the tide in terms of falling popularity. But it doesn't really change anything on the ground, really. It's no substantive change there. It's just prototypical pandering, pretty much.
And I think he did something with this that reset his term limit or whatever.
Yeah, that was in Reddit. Supposedly they slipped something into bill that reset it, but I don't think that really matters much because they already had the constitutional referendum that allegedly wasn't a referendum. They had to call it something else. They did that last year, summer 2020, and we talked a bit about that and how that kind of reformed Russia's political system a little bit to kind of give him the room that he wants in order to have a kind of ambiguous role in government. He can stay on as president if he wants to. I mean, nobody's shocked by that. But if he doesn't, he'll still have a lot of influence just because of the way that they kind of rejigged the system there. They've got the new governor's council institution that they've set up, and I think a couple other changes as well. So yeah, I did read that the term limits were reset, but that was kind of a formality. That's no shock. The big change was last summer with the referendum. That's when he really kind of set the groundwork for his succession and eventual easing away from Russian politics. Yeah, Russia is kind of they're pretty much just on trend. There's not a whole lot going on there. I mean, there's been protests and stuff over Navalny, but overall the government isn't really in all that much danger, I don't think. I don't sense that they're all that threatened. They have gotten a lot more confrontational and illiberal
Mm.
as far as how they're treating dissent and in terms of political freedoms. But I don't know that that really signals concern on the part of the Russian government so much as a shift in strategy. Because before, Russia's inner, not Russia, Putin's inner circle was more kind of diverse. There was more variety in terms of the expertise that was there. You had more guys like Kudrin and Surkov. But now I think he's leaning much more hard on the Siloviki, so these national security apparatus veterans who have a very hawkish view of the world. And, they never really much liked sort of the liberal perspective on governance. And in turn, Russian governance has shifted away from that and become more, I guess you could say, traditionally Russian in a sense. So that's more of an internal thing, I think.
Mm.
But I don't think Putin's government is terribly threatened, or if they are, I don't think they should be. If things keep getting worse, then maybe they will, but I think for now they're doing okay. I think the bigger thing that they would worry about is inflation. There's been more of that, specifically in wheat, I think it was, in Russia. But they implemented an export ban to try to stem that, which may or may not help their farmers. I'm sure they would have preferred to have the higher prices, but if you're a government, higher prices don't really behoove your interests. You like prices to stay low so people don't get antsy. So they put the export ban in place. Russia's a pretty big exporter of wheat. So when world prices go up, Russia kind of feels that pretty significantly.
That's wheat, not weed. Yeah.
Yeah, wheat. Yeah, there's actually a lot of stuff going on. Trump leaving office kind of unlocked American foreign policy, and that's kind of shifted the ground in some ways. And there were some other things that all kind of reached a tipping point in different parts of the world. So everything's all kind of happening at once after kind of 2 years or so of relative benign foreign policy developments. Because 2019 was mostly protest.
Mm.
But other than that, there wasn't a whole lot going on, I don't think. And then in 2020, it was pretty much just COVID and stuff related to COVID, but a lot of other foreign policy priorities kind of got put on the back burner. So that was as true for the United States as it was for many other governments. Lots of governments had projects and policy priorities that they had to put on hold to kind of deal with COVID. But now that's kind of on the way out, more or less. And as a result, I think the world is moving forward. So we're kind of back where we left off at the end of 2019, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So we're definitely not going to have time to get to all of it today. I haven't even been able to organize everything. It's all been happening so quickly. But I can try to give you some of the highlights anyway. Let's see. The other thing with Russia that I had was that they're massing troops on their border with Ukraine, which is a little ominous. I'm not entirely sure why. They had some military exercises recently that ended, so they may have just decided to deploy them to try to intimidate the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government has been taking some actions that have aggravated Moscow a little bit. They banned a television station that was owned by a pro-Russian oligarch. I don't have his name in front of me, but basically it was a news station, or at least the television, partly broadcasted news, and a lot of it was more pro-Russian and anti-Kiev. So the Zelensky government in Ukraine decided to basically just take away their license, I guess it was. And Moscow wasn't too happy with that. And I think there was also some more violence on the frontier with the breakaway republics. Although I don't know if that's more than usual, since I know that there's never really been like a full ceasefire over there in eastern Ukraine. So for whatever reason, uh, I'm sure those are contributing factors, but for whatever reason, the Russian government has seen fit to deploy a pretty substantive number of Russian troops over on its border with eastern Ukraine, and that's got some people in Ukraine and also in Washington a little antsy. They're not entirely sure what to make of it. So that could be something to keep an eye on. We'll see how that plays out. I think one opinion I read is that it was Moscow trying to test the Biden administration to see how much they would support the Ukrainian government. So it could be just as simple as that. It could just be the Russians trying to kind of tease out just what Washington's policy on Ukraine is going to be for the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
That's about all I had for Russia.
Yeah, so far it seemed like Biden has spoke out more against Putin, but the question is, like, what is he going to do different from the Trump administration?
Probably not too much, because Trump kind of got boxed in by his own style of government, I guess. He was just a little too blasé about his relationship with Putin, and so Congress, including Republicans, saw fit to pass some laws, basically, that forced him to take a hard line on Putin. Probably there was more stuff he could have done. Trump's specialty was never nuance. So there was probably some room for more creativity in terms of the U.S. relationship with Russia. But regardless, he still maintained sanctions and expanded them to a degree. I think it was more personalized sanctions, targeting individuals, that kind of thing. So it was pretty much status quo for most of the Trump administration as far as tensions between the U.S. and Russia. There wasn't a lot of room that Trump had to maneuver there. So I don't think Biden will do too much differently. I think he'll probably try more diplomacy. I think they did not renegotiate, but I think they did negotiate an extension to the New START agreement, which is a nuclear weapons agreement, arms control agreement, I should say. And they'll probably take a look at some of the other arms agreements that the Trump administration scrapped, that Russia is particularly interested in. Open skies agreement, for example, stuff like that. They'll probably try to negotiate that with Moscow. But other than that, I don't see much changing. I don't think the Russian government is going to change its foreign policy. I don't think they're going to give up on pressuring Ukraine or Georgia or any of the other places that they have quote-unquote peacekeeper troops deployed. So most likely those pre-existing tensions will just continue. And I don't think the United States is going to be any more committed to really solving the problem. If the United States really wanted to bring pressure to bear on Russia, it could, but it hasn't really been sufficiently invested in issues like Ukraine and whatnot to really care all that much. So it's probably going to be a secondary foreign policy issue, much as it has been for the past 7 years. Since 2014 is pretty much when the relationship kind of collapsed on account of Euromaidan and related events.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of anticipate stagnation on that front, at least for the moment. That could change if Russia does something ballsy in eastern Ukraine. I'm still not entirely sure what they'll do there. But unless they do something dramatic, I don't know that the United States is really invested enough to make a dramatic change there. Yeah.
While we're in the region, someone's asking if there's anything interesting happening in Polish foreign policy.
In Polish foreign policy? That's an interesting question. I don't know that Poland has all that active a foreign policy, really. I think they were trying to kind of reach out to Ukraine a little bit last year, but I don't know if that went anywhere. Other than that, I think Poland's foreign policy is pretty much mostly preoccupied with trying to deal with the European Union, because the European Union is not all that happy with some of the policy changes that have been made in Poland over the past couple years. There was the whole judicial imbroglio, with the Polish government trying to politicize the judiciary. I know that's a little controversial because the counter argument is that it was actually the pre-existing government that politicized it first, and that the Law and Justice Party was just retaliating to that. But regardless of how you want to frame it, the European Union has not been very comfortable with the changes that the Law and Justice Party has made in Poland to the judicial system, and so there's been a lot of tension over that. So navigating that minefield, I think, has been kind of their main foreign policy thing. I'm sure they've tried some outreach with some other countries, but I don't know off the top of my head of what it would be. And then there was a big stink over the whole abortion thing, although I think that was mostly domestic. I don't think that the European Union really had any business kind of commenting on that. But it didn't really help the image that Poland has kind of built over the past couple of years, that it's one of the so-called illiberal democracies in Eastern Europe that are undermining the nominal dedication that the European Union tries to uphold to rule of law and corresponding liberal tenets. But yeah, other than that, I can't say that I can think of anything in Polish foreign policy. I remember there was some drama at the end of 2020 about the European Union's relief bill, because there was a bunch of drama about whether or not the European Union would be able to band together and pass some kind of relief package to help countries deal with COVID-19 and the economic fallout thereof. And they were actually able to negotiate that successfully, which had a lot of Europhiles pretty excited. But kind of at the last minute, it ended up getting vetoed by Poland and Hungary. And the reason they vetoed it is because one of the provisions in the bill was to try to condition funding on meeting certain rule of law requirements. And basically, that was seen as explicitly targeting Poland and Hungary, which was not particularly appreciated by the respective governments. So they shut that down, and I think they ended up having to pull those provisions in order to get the bill passed. So that was a successful exercise in fighting for its self-interest there. But that was last year. I don't know of anything recently that I could point to. Maybe somebody in chat knows more than I do. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer here. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, obviously. So if I ever say anything that's wrong, stupid, or biased, chat is encouraged to correct me. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. So corrections are appreciated. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So definitely do kind of pitch in there.
Wait, you don't know everything?
No.
Oh.
Sadly not. Oh, but it were otherwise. Well, any other hot spots for you, Neuro?
There's the China-Taiwan thing that's sort of a drama point. There was one documentary I watched this week on the NFL and their knowledge of concussions and how that relates to long-term brain damage for players, and how there was a bunch of different kind of political moves that were made within the organization that tried to delay addressing the problem for as long as possible, because it's not good for business if the sport is seen as unsafe, because there's the whole cultural aspect of people grow up playing the sport, and it's seen as in some places like Texas, a sort of rite of passage and coming of age thing. Mm-hmm. When if you pitch it more as, well, maybe your kid could suffer brain injuries and brain damage, moms and dads are a lot less keen to send their kid off to football practice. So knowing the science behind that, and also just generally supporting the former players, which it has a lot of parallels with the way that veterans are treated. Football is kind of like war in that you're engaging in a form of combat and you take damage in combat, and people usually leave the battlefield with some wounds. And ideally, if you're wanting them to be soldiers for you, you're going to take care of them after. And if you don't recognize concussions as causing long-term brain injury, then they're not really providing support for them. So it went over a bunch of different phases of how keen they were to actually take a hard look at the science, as opposed to maybe do some of their own research that said, no, it's not a big deal. And the different neurosurgeons and people who were working hard on figuring out that puzzle. And it's a puzzle that was only really able to be solved as brain imaging got better. So for the early era of football, you can't really do a brain scan to the same extent, or study the brains to the same extent that you can now. But a lot of players who passed away died young. I think Mark Webster is one of the players. He played for the Steelers, and he passed away when he was 50 years old. His body was severely banged up, and his brain looked like the brain of like a 90-year-old with Alzheimer's and dementia. So it really accelerates the aging process, and it's pretty yikes and dangerous. I played football from maybe 5th to 6th grade through all of middle school, and then for my first 2 years of high school, and then I left and went to university early. But it was a big part of my life. I didn't sustain a concussion while I was playing, though I do remember getting like hit pretty hard a few times. Pretty much everybody who played did. But it's an interesting frontier of learning about the human body and the brain. In my opinion, like with sports, if people understand the risks and they're willing to take them, then that's their decision to make. There will probably still be people who play football, just like they determine that boxing can cause concussions and people continue to box. Yeah, that was kind of my knowledge gain for the week.
I'm impressed at how much you remembered.
About the documentary?
Yeah, about the documentary.
Oh, yeah.
I don't retain information that well.
What are you talking about? We have you come on here all the time and you retain, or you share tons of information.
I've got tons of notes to go along with it.
Oh. Well, I did watch it like yesterday, so it's still pretty fresh.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that, and I don't know, I was surprised and not surprised. Surprised in the sense that it had been happening so long, but not surprised in the sense that it's a violent sport, in the sense that there's a lot of physicality to it. People really get knocked around, and people getting concussions and whatnot is not uncommon. So the idea that it actually does do significant long-term damage.
It's not everyone. The people who I think were at the worst risk were people on the offensive line, where they're the ones who are receiving the first impact of the entire defense. And that's a lot of force. And it isn't just like people ramming into each other is bad, which, yeah, maybe that's true. But in this case, you're looking at the biggest and the strongest people in the country are ramming into each other. So it's that much more power and momentum for these hits that are happening, which is pretty intense G-forces that are applied to the brain. You can take some hits, but if you take enough hits that are hard enough over time, you're going to sustain some damage. I played strong safety and wide receiver, so I was pretty far away from that front line of people hitting each other. Usually they put the heaviest guys there, and I was always more lean in my physique. But yeah, learned a little bit about sports and brain science. I was a little bit rustled by the commissioner in the NFL putting some rheumatologist or something as the lead researcher for how playing in the NFL affects your brain and that kind of thing, when there were other people in the league who had a background in brain science. So it seemed like they didn't really want to know the answer to the question. They were just procrastinating, like, well, this guy says that it's not a big deal, so let's put him in charge.
Yeah, procrastination is a viable strategy if there's something that you don't want to do.
Yeah, the size of the industry is incredible. It's the biggest sport in the US by viewership on the TV shows and stuff. And just the ticket values of all the different games in the stadiums, and then there's Super Bowl commercials which are like $1 billion a pop. It's a silly amount of money that's at stake here. So they want to keep as much of that as they can, basically. But then there's the pain of the players over time. A lot of the wives of the players in the NFL were collaborating together to share their perspective, because they can see it firsthand of their husband who's in the league, and he's an incredible player. And many of them are pretty smart guys who maybe they went to a nice university and they're really sharp. And there's decision making in football too. So it's not just a bunch of thugs. You've got people who have really good instincts and they know how to make plays in addition to being strong and fast. But then they're remembering less stuff over time. They're just more irritable, and they can forget how to do basic tasks and stuff like dress themselves, so which is pretty silly, but it happens a lot more for people who are very advanced in age.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, interesting stuff. I think it's a Frontline documentary. League of Denial was the title.
Huh. Yeah, I remember when that came out, there was a big hullabaloo about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think the repercussions are kind of still being felt,
Mm-hmm.
because the NFL has had to implement a number of policy changes in terms of how it deals with concussions and whatnot. And the players' union, of course, has been pushing pretty hard for those changes in the light of the discoveries. So, not surprising. We'll see what the NFL looks like in 10 years. It could be very different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've heard about football getting more popular in China, weirdly. I wouldn't have expected that. Basketball is kind of more the sport over there, but I've heard that there's some interest in football, especially amongst the youth. It's kind of like it's kind of funny. They kind of are treating it like we treat soccer here in the U.S. You know, it's not necessarily a broadly popular sport. It's kind of more associated with the sort of suburban middle class type people, you know, soccer moms and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something similar going on in China, where some of the more well-off upper middle class types have taken an interest in enrolling their kids in football, because they see it as being kind of a nice extracurricular, you know, kind of a team building, character building type deal.
I would say it certainly is. Like, if you have good coaches, you can learn a lot of life lessons there. A lot of what I preach in the stream about being respectful to your opponents and your teammates is something that I learned in football. But you could technically learn that in other sports. It's just a hard physical sport. You can learn life lessons in basically any of them, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But team sports especially, they require some collaboration.
I played baseball for one season, I think. That's about the only team sport experience I have. I was extraordinarily bad at it. Like, they stuck me in, what is it, left field?
Mm-hmm.
Left field or right field, you know, the one that they kind of stick you if you can't play baseball, basically. Wow. So what, was there any others you wanted to hit on here?
I watched another documentary on DPRK, Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Of Korea. Congo?
Sorry. Yeah. I just did the wrong acronym.
You did the right acronym.
I did the right
acronym.
acronym.
Wrong country.
Oh, sorry. Congo.
DRC.
DRC. Is it K in the African language that they speak?
I don't think so.
Oh.
Well, they don't really have like the letter K in the native language, I don't think. It's Congo is the French name. I'm not sure what it would be in like
Right. So they speak French there. The it was like Elysium. Have you seen that movie?
I have
Elysium
not,
is a
but I
Matt
think I did
Damon movie. There's like
Yeah.
a super wealthy part. I think it's like on a space station or something, and then there's a really poor area as well. And in this documentary, it talks about the huge amount of like raw material wealth that's in the country, and how you have some people who are super hella rich. They have lots of millionaires, but then like just over on the other side of the river, people who are living in slums. And it's visible and kind of palpable, the disparity in wealth.
Did that have a rapper in it?
Yes.
I think I saw that on YouTube. Yeah. I think maybe we saw the same one. Yeah. Oh, I think I did put that on Twitter.
Oh, nice.
I think I did anyway. Maybe my memory is playing tricks on me. Yeah, that was pretty good. I don't know a whole lot about Africa. That's kind of one of my weak spots. So I thought it was pretty cool to kind of get a snapshot of city life. Because when people talk about Congo, they're always talking about like Eastern Congo, where all the fighting happens. You know, the warlords, the rape, resource. What do they call them? Conflict diamonds. You know, that kind of thing. That's more Eastern Congo. People don't really pay much attention to Western Congo, which is more stable, basically, and relatively more peaceful. And in particular, Kinshasa, which is a very large city. Kinshasa is actually the second largest French-speaking city in the world. And it doesn't get a lot of attention unless something is going really wrong. So it was pretty cool to see a documentary where you kind of got to see a little bit of that. Interesting trivia. Kinshasa, for those who don't know what I'm talking about, Kinshasa is the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC. And it's right on the Congo River, which is one of the major rivers of the world. You know, it's a huge river that goes pretty deep into Central Africa. And it's not actually on the ocean. That is to say, the city, Kinshasa, it's actually kind of a little bit inland. And the interesting thing is that the river itself actually forms the border between the DRC and the Republic of Congo, which is immediately to the northwest of the DRC. And it doesn't comprise the border for like the full length of the river. It's just like the first, whatever it is, first couple hundred miles or so. But the interesting thing is that Kinshasa is right on the river, and then right across the river from Kinshasa is Brazzaville, the capital of the Republic of Congo. So in an alternate universe, it would probably just be one city, Kinshasa and Brazzaville. It would be one larger metro area. I mean, technically it is one larger metro area now, but they have separate city governments because they're in separate countries. But just weird historical serendipity that both of those cities ended up in different countries and the capitals of their respective countries. Some random trivia. Okay. So much stuff, Neuro. What region would you like?
Let's do maybe Central Asia.
Central Asia. Interesting choice. Okay, so I think the only thing, well, I mean, unless you want to count Xinjiang or Kashmir as part of Central Asia, technically they are, but I think you're referring more to the 5 former Soviet republics. The only thing I have for Central Asia in that regard is Kyrgyzstan. They're actually voting on a new not a new constitution. I think it's a constitutional amendment. Now that I try to remember, I can't remember, of course. But basically, they want to shift their political system from a parliamentary system, which is what it is now, towards a presidential system. And the idea there is to have a more centralized executive, which is probably not the best idea. The reason they want to do it is because having a decentralized political system, as they had with the parliamentary system, was causing just problems. There was so much dysfunction between all the different political parties that hardly anything of substance could really get done. So the thinking goes that a stronger centralized government with a stronger executive would result in more efficient government that is less volatile, more consistent in terms of its ability to get things done. Um, the counter argument is that having a more centralized executive in a developing country with a somewhat mixed record in terms of the health of its democracy is going to open the door to abuses of power. You only have to win an election once in a weak democracy in order to kind of seize control, and that's kind of it. And that's sort of the fear here. Whether or not that fear is justified, I can't entirely say. I'm not sufficiently familiar with Kyrgyzstan's political culture. But I am a little concerned by the individual whom is currently in charge of the government. I think his name is Jasparov. You would actually know who he was if I'd ever gotten around to my Kyrgyzstan notes that I made last year. Last year was very eventful for Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan had a general election, I think around summer 2020, and it turned into a huge shit show. There was allegations of vote buying and electoral fraud and all manner of this kind of thing. And the result was mass protests. The government, basically local governments being overthrown and having local political parties appointing their own people as heads of the local governments. And the national government basically just didn't have any political party in charge for like a month or so. So it was very chaotic for a while there. And it kind of took a while for the country to kind of pull itself together under a new government. I think they ended up just letting the previous prime minister kind of stay on an extra month or two, just until things calmed down, and that was pretty much how that was resolved. But that still left unresolved the question of how to prevent it from happening again, and that's kind of where the current constitutional referendum comes from. But the prime minister who's in charge right now is a guy named Jasparov, and he was actually in prison for murder, if memory serves, when that unrest happened last summer. And the only reason he got out is because his supporters broke him out of prison. And he's, from what I remember reading, he's kind of a far-right guy. I don't know that he's ideologically far-right. When it comes to corrupt political systems like in Kyrgyzstan, ideology doesn't really mean as much. It's not as important to politics as patronage, your ability to get resources to your supporters. So maybe it doesn't mean too much that he's far right, but technically his politics are far right. And that's kind of where the concern comes in with the current constitutional changes being offered. It's kind of problematic enough in a weak democracy to centralize your political system. It's even worse when the guy in charge who's going to benefit is more of a far-right politician, because of course the far right in most any country generally only has a cursory dedication to the liberal tenets of liberal democracy. So the concern is that this Jasparov guy is basically just going to become president, and he's just going to abuse all of the new centralized powers in his office as president. But it could be exaggerated. Maybe they'll hold new elections if they change the constitution, and then maybe somebody more less extreme basically kind of gets in. But we'll see. Kyrgyzstan is kind of called Central Asia's only democracy, which is technically true, but it's not a high bar. Pretty much every other country is some form of authoritarian, and Kyrgyzstan's democracy has a rough track record. There's been, I think, 3 de facto revolutions in Kyrgyzstan over the past 20 years. There was a famous color revolution there way back in the early aughts. I don't remember what the color was. Maybe somebody in chat remembers better than I do. So that kind of threw out an oligarchic, corrupt political leader that had been governing Kyrgyzstan for a while. And then after he was gone, the system kind of more or less liberalized, but there was still a lot of ethnic tension, a lot of partisanship, a lot of jockeying for power, and that resulted in some major unrest around 2010 or so. I want to say, roughly speaking. That was basically when the northern chunk of the country was unhappy with the southern chunk. There's actually kind of obviously it's a very mountainous country, but there's a particular mountain chain that separates the northern and southern parts of the country, and the two, north and south, have different ethnic compositions, and they don't entirely get along. So that was kind of more the dividing line in 2010. And then, of course, there was all of the unrest last year that I already mentioned. So that's a pretty volatile track record just by itself for most any country. So that is kind of the impetus there for the constitutional change. Hopefully it works out for them, but we'll see. That's definitely something to keep an eye on.
You mentioned Kashmir as being technically Central Asia, but probably not what I was mentioning. Was there something that happened there?
Not really. I think last year the Indian government eventually eased the internet restrictions that they had put in place. They had broadly basically just stopped people from using the internet. I think if you wanted to use the internet, you had to go to like a central location overseen by the army that the army had set up. And even then, it was really, really slow. So a lot of internet-based industries really suffered in Kashmir. So they were pretty happy when they started relaxing them. I don't think they've been fully relaxed yet. I don't think it's back to the way it was before they imposed the restrictions, but it has gotten better considerably. So I think that's the only significant change there. There's still people in Kashmir are still pretty unhappy with the changes that were made. In 2019, that was when Kashmir was basically partitioned, for lack of a better word. The Indian government passed a law that broke Kashmir actually into territories, and instead of a state, it's now going to be what's called a union territory. So kind of roughly the Indian equivalent of what Puerto Rico is in the United States. It's a territory, actually with even less autonomy than Puerto Rico, though. It's basically a territory governed by the government directly, instead of having a state government that is largely autonomous and that shares governance with the central government. So obviously, a lot of people were pretty upset about that because they did not have the permission of the local Kashmiri authorities in doing that. And that's actually why they restricted internet access. They were afraid that there would be a massive backlash. And Kashmir, of course, has a history of insurgent activity. So the Indian government was concerned that there would be a major uptick in violence. And so they flooded the country with troops and restricted access to the internet. I think those were the two main things. They're actually really sneaky about it because they actually flooded the troops in before they did that. But they were talking about routine counterinsurgent. They justified it in terms of routine counterinsurgency activity. So they knew they were going to have a problem and that they needed to send troops in, but they did it really quietly. And because Kashmir has had so many problems with counterinsurgency for so long, I don't think even a lot of experienced media watchers, people familiar with the Kashmir issue, really kind of cottoned on to the fact that they were up to something. So a successful sneak on the part of the Indian government there. It's not a small amount either. India has a huge amount of troops in Kashmir. It's actually pretty crazy. I think at one point they had as many as 500,000 troops in Kashmir. And it wasn't because there was a war. They were just trying to clamp down on the insurgent activity. One of the reasons that people in Kashmir are unhappy with India is because there's just so many troops there. And the Indian government imposes a kind of martial law in the territory that results in a lot of discretion being given to individual troops. And of course, when you give discretion to troops or police or whomever, there's almost invariably going to be abuses. So unfortunately, that's resulted in the death and torture in some cases of a lot of innocent civilians. Not saying that the insurgents don't always give as good as they get, but that is why there's so much opposition in Kashmir to the Indian government. A lot of it is really just the martial law, more so than a burning desire to be independent or to join Pakistan or anything like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Central Asia kind of expands beyond the Big Five. The five former Soviet republics Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. Generally, when people talk about Central Asia, that's pretty much what they're referring to. But Central Asia also encompasses sort of the central Siberian territory that Russia controls. Sort of that, what do they call that? The taiga, right there east of the Ural Mountains. They've got a huge stretch of taiga over there, and part of that is sort of part of Central Asia. They've also got what's called a black earth belt, just a long belt of black earth agricultural land that stretches from Ukraine into almost to the Far East. And that's that belt of land there at that specific latitude is where most of the population in Siberia is concentrated. That's good land, so there was a lot of farmers that wanted to work it. That wanted to move there and take advantage of that. And the Russian government under the Tsar, and then later on under the Soviets, really pushed migration into the region, into that specific belt of territory, specifically to take advantage of that fertile land. Black Earth is pretty much always very fertile, so it's very good, productive agricultural land. So that belt of territory is technically part of Central Asia. Some of it actually bleeds into northern Kazakhstan, which is why northern Kazakhstan has relatively more ethnic Russians. That's sort of a legacy of the Russian farmers moving into that particular region. That was all just Russia for a long time, so it's not like they were moving into Kazakhstan. They just wanted to settle the territory. And then after the Soviet Union broke apart, they just kind of ended up in Kazakhstan, just kind of by historical accident. So let's see, the Black Earth Belt there is in Central Asia. Xinjiang in Western China is part of Central Asia. Tibet also Central Asia. Kashmir, Northern India. All of that is pretty much part of that sort of broader region. But because China is considered a Far Eastern country, we don't talk about, Western China in those. We don't generally talk about Western China when people talk about Central Asia. Mm-hmm. And similar with India, it's considered South Asian. So when people talk about Central Asia, Kashmir doesn't necessarily come to mind intuitively. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have about Central Asia news anyway, at least as far as new things. We could talk more about it in general if you wanted, but as far as news, that's all I've got.
The next one I was curious about was South America.
South America. South America has been very colorful the past couple months. Gosh, where do you even start with them? I think just as a side note here, just in terms of American foreign policy, I think the United States is going to have to start paying more attention to Latin America and its foreign policy. Because since the Cold War ended, we've pretty much largely taken a hands-off approach. I know that a lot of people say that the U.S. interfered with the Chavista governments, and that's true to a degree. But really, if they'd really wanted to shut that down, they probably could have. But by and large, there was just a lot of disinterest in dealing with Latin America. I think without the Soviet Union and the overarching threat of communism, there was a broader desire to just kind of pull back and kind of leave the region to its own devices. It had been messy for a long time. And I think everybody, in Latin America and in the United States was pretty happy with that. But things have been changing the past 10 years. China's economic ties with the region have been growing. Chavista governments have gotten, more and less popular depending on the country, but they've certainly become more of a relevant political force. And there's always the risk that they could align with a China or a Russia or, whatever extracontinental power that may be interested. I don't think they would, because I think they know that would be a big problem for the United States. But hypothetically, it could happen. And if a Chavista state, pretty much Venezuela, were to get desperate enough, they may try to do something like that. So I think Washington is going to be a lot more interested in Latin American affairs going forward, if only for that reason. That doesn't even get into the immigration problems with Central America. That's, a whole other reason that they'll probably be paying more attention to them. But so I just bring that up because I think Latin America will be in the news more, basically, in the United States over the next 10 years. I think it's going to be a more relevant foreign policy arena in the future. But let's see. Other than that, I guess we could start with Brazil, because Bolsonaro is kind of, I don't want to say he's imploding, but he's been having some problems. One of the things I had in my notes is that people have been complaining about the government's handling of COVID-19, because Bolsonaro is kind of taking the Trump approach, which is downplaying it and not taking it particularly seriously. He's kind of doing bare minimum. And one of the statements he issued in response to criticism was, "Stop whining about it."
Stop whining.
Yeah, that's a quote. That's verbatim. Quote, "Stop whining about it," end quote.
But, so sire, people are dying. They should complain less as they die. Wow, brutal.
Yeah, that's kind of been their approach down there. And I think I think a week or two ago, he was accusing regional governments, which, some of which are, well, actually, I think a lot of which are controlled by other political parties besides his own. And they generally take COVID more seriously. And he actually came out and accused them of quote unquote tyranny because they were taking it more seriously and imposing lockdowns and, other corresponding COVID related measures. So the government there has kind of floundered in terms of its COVID response, and it's been getting significantly worse. The healthcare system is under a lot of strain, specifically in the past month. The numbers have just been spiraling. And it's not as though Brazil's healthcare system was terribly robust in the first place. It's not bad per se, but it's still a developing country. They've only got so many resources, and COVID is really starting to hit them pretty hard. But Bolsonaro has not responded to that by changing tack. So he's been under a lot of pressure in turn. So his popularity has been waning, and he's been responding to that with more belligerence. He recently had to change health ministers because the old one resigned. And I think the bigger news had to do with the military. Because one of the things that Bolsonaro has done in his political career has been to kind of flirt with military governance. One of the things he did when he was still running for office a couple years ago is to say that he thought that military rule in Brazil had been a good thing. Of course, the military ran Brazil pretty much directly for, I think, a couple decades. There was a big military coup in the mid-1960s. And military governance in Brazil did not end until the mid-1980s or so. So there's about 20 years of military rule there. And a lot of people didn't like it for obvious reasons. Obviously they targeted people on the left in particular as part of anti-communist measures that they took. But governance in general kind of left something to be desired during the period. So a lot of people are not particularly positive on it. But there are people on the political right in Brazil who kind of laud that period of history as being better than the present. They think the military did a better job than the current democratic government that Brazil has had. So basically preferring military authoritarianism to liberal democracy. And Bolsonaro has kind of flirted with that. I don't think he's ever said that he wants military governance back, but he has kind of hinted that he didn't think it was all that bad and that maybe it wouldn't be so bad in the future. So one of the things he's done over the past year has been to kind of push the military to be more explicitly for him, to kind of politicize the military. And apparently it got bad enough that I think last week, all of the heads of the different services, Air Force, Navy, and Army, resigned en masse all at the same time, which has never happened before in Brazil's history. It was a pretty dramatic movement. So on the plus side, the fact that they resigned showed that the military, or at least those particular officers, is relatively at least dedicated to upholding liberal democracy. Maintaining civilian control of the military is an important part of maintaining and running a liberal democracy. And establishing that norm is pretty difficult. So there's been some question since Brazil democratized about just how dedicated the military would be to maintaining Brazilian democracy in the face of a significant challenge. And it seems that they've passed a test in this case. So that's the positive side. The negative side is that a civilian leader, specifically the president of Brazil, is putting the military in a position where they have to make that decision, where they have to make the call about whether or not what they're being asked to do is threatening liberal democratic norms. So that's the downside. So there's some question about just what Bolsonaro is up to and just what he was asking them to do. I'm not sufficiently familiar with Brazilian politics to know if there's been more news about the details as to what he was asking them to do that led them to resign. But history, precedent, given how he's behaved in the past, the suspicion is that he was asking them to intervene in Brazilian politics somehow, which would, of course, be a pretty dramatic event in terms of Brazilian democracy. So there's been quite a bit of coverage of that down in Brazil. There's been a lot of drama down there over not only COVID, but about Bolsonaro's moves vis-a-vis the military. I don't know if we have any. Do we have any Brazilians listening? Maybe they could give us a first-hand account.
Brazil was specifically asked about
Oh, cool.
mass migration to California.
To California?
CA was the acronym. Maybe it's not California.
Huh. I've heard of a mass exodus out of California, but I haven't heard about mass migration into California. There's a lot of people from Central America trying to get into the United States. That's the so-called crisis at the border that the media has been focusing on. But that hasn't been just California. That's kind of just been the U.S. in general. At least I don't think it's California in particular. Yeah, I did see we had 2 people in Brazil listening. They may or not actually be Brazilian. We can only see the flag where the person is, not necessarily their ethnicity. But if we do have some Brazilians listening, we would certainly appreciate your thoughts on what's been happening. First-hand accounts are always a really cool aspect of doing this.
CA as in Central America, because there's a water crisis in Brazil.
Gotcha. A water crisis in Brazil. I hadn't heard about that. I'll have to stick that in a tab here. I've read about Venezuelan refugees coming into northwestern Brazil. Well, maybe not northwestern, northern Brazil. I think it was Roraima state. I'm probably mispronouncing it or misremembering it. I've read about that, but I haven't read about people from Central America coming to Brazil. That would be a new one on me. I'll have to look into that. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of I don't know what you would call them, asylum seekers, I guess, from Central America that have been moving up from Mexico to try to get to the U.S. border and try to get into the U.S. as refugees. Actually, I guess I could just look at the notes for that. Let me see if I can find that for us. No, not that. I think it's this. Yeah, the Biden administration has been reversing the Trump administration's policies on handling refugees. So the Trump administration took a pretty hard line. They really wanted to discourage refugees from coming. So they put a lot of pressure on Mexico to deploy troops to their southern border to make it harder for people to get up into Mexico so that they could go to the border with the U.S. And they also kind of pushed the Mexican government into agreeing to hosting refugee applicants. Basically, when you get to the U.S. border, you can ask for asylum, and the U.S. in turn will process your application. And it used to be that while your application was being processed, they would actually let you in the country and stay for a while until that application, could be processed. But the Trump administration pushed Mexico into agreeing to host them instead. So instead of staying in the United States while your application was processed, you had to stay in Mexico. And the Mexican government did not really dedicate a whole lot of resources to housing and feeding and taking care of the refugee applicants. So it was not a particularly favorable policy change for the refugees in question. And that was probably by design. Again, the Trump administration's whole approach was to just try to make it as uncomfortable as possible in order to discourage people from kind of making the trip and applying. So the Biden administration has basically undone that, unsurprisingly. Let me see here. So the big question has been whether or not the surge that we've seen over the past couple months has been because of the Biden administration making these changes. And without kind of getting into the details here, from what I read, the answer is probably no. There is, obviously it hasn't hurt it. Obviously the Biden administration being more open and receptive to refugees has encouraged them. But it doesn't seem likely that this particular surge is only a function of that. From the data that I was reading about, in the relevant article, surges like this have been happening pretty much every year for several years now, maybe going back a decade. I'd have to look at the article again to get the exact time frame. But this is actually pretty standard. This actually happened every year of the Trump administration at pretty much this exact same time. And the scale was also pretty similar. It's larger this year, but from what I read, the suspicion amongst analysts is that it's larger this year because COVID travel restrictions, not only in the United States, but also in Mexico and Central American governments, made it more difficult to cross borders and make the trip. So basically, there's pent-up demand from last year that's kind of bleeding over into this year. So in addition to the normal surge that we would expect to see given the data, there's a bunch of pent-up demand from last year that's also adding on to that. So it's particularly large. So it's not, again, I don't want to say that Biden isn't contributing to it at all, because again, he is being more receptive, does encourage more people to come. But I would also push back on the assertion that it's only because of that. I mean, the data shows that this is a recurring phenomenon. So I don't think it's only because of that. Basically, we would just expect this to happen at this point. If you're wondering why it's happening, it's kind of push and pull factors. In Central America, there's been a lot of problems with gang violence. The economies are pretty weak. In the case of Honduras, at least, the local economy hasn't really recovered since a big hurricane hit it a couple years ago. I don't remember exactly when it was, but it apparently did just a lot of damage to the point where there's significantly less opportunity. The recovery has been a very prolonged process. So natural disasters, violence, corrupt governments. The governments in Central America just haven't been able to handle a lot of the problems down there. There's been some efforts at trying to tackle it, but it's been very hit or miss. In El Salvador, they have a populist government that was elected because it was very not anti per se, but that it was supposed to be strong on crime, on fighting crime. But then I think there was a leak that kind of suggested that their approach to fighting crime involved negotiating with some of the larger criminal groups. And then a lot of governments in Central America are tied up in drug trafficking. The president of Honduras, I think, had his brother arrested in the United States for being involved in drug trafficking. So drug traffickers have basically a lot of political influence in Central America, just on account of all the resources that they have to put into things like bribes and whatnot. So that also results in ineffective government, because there's just no incentive really for government to significantly crack down on it. So that means that gangs can kind of go unmolested, they can cause more problems, more violence, and that just pushes even more people out. And then there's the pull factors. The US economy still has lots of open jobs for people that are willing to work blue collar, low wage type jobs, basically. There's still a lot of demand for that. So there's, you can make good money here in the United States if you're Central American and you're willing to kind of chance it. If you can get in illegally, you can get what would in the United States be considered a very poor paying job, but by the standards of Central America, that's actually pretty decent. And we know that it's pretty decent money by Central American standards because there's a lot of remittance money that goes back to Central America and pays for things like new houses, refurbishments, education for kids. Like, the money goes really far in Central America, and it's actually really useful down there. But in the United States, not a lot of people want to work those jobs. Stuff like janitor or cleaning, what would you call them, meat processing plants, butcher, sort of these kinds of jobs are what they're kind of getting, and they'll save money and send it back, and it helps a lot. So that's a significant pull factor there. So between the push and the pull factors, there's a lot of incentive to do it, and those factors have been in place for a while now. I'm not sufficiently familiar with the issue to know why it started in the first place. Again, it started sometime in the past 10 years. I don't remember this really being a thing back in like the aughts or the 90s. I think back then it was more Mexican immigration than Central American immigration. So I would have to do more research to kind of dig into why Central America in particular has been driving this phenomenon in recent years. But other than that, I would just, other than that, that's the push and pull factors. If you want to know why it specifically happens in January, February, March, that apparently has to do with the weather. So in the article I read, again, digging into the data, generally there are 2 surges like this a year. One of them is at the end of winter, again, January, February, March, roughly. And then the other one is more after summer, sort of in fall. And as you might infer, this is seasonal. Basically, it's too cold in winter, so people will stop trying to make the trip then. They'll wait for the weather to kind of warm up so that it's safer. So then they'll kind of come up then in January, February, March, once things kind of warm up. And then later on in the summer, it just gets way too hot. Again, we're talking about people who are trying to cross the border illegally. And so a lot of the times that involves moving through the southwestern desert in the United States. And that's very dangerous. So doing it in summer just makes it even more dangerous because it's even more hot. It makes more sense to try to do it when it's a little cooler. So there's a big surge after summer ends, around fall. So 2 times a year is when the surges happen, and they happen specifically because it's kind of too dangerous in the winter and summer. So that's what I read about it anyway. So I wouldn't, again, to kind of bring this back to the Biden administration, obviously the policies are encouraging it, but that's not the only part of the story. Also, there are push and pull factors that make it just inherent, that it's going to happen regardless. And there's also seasonal factors that kind of push it during certain times of year, such that we would just kind of expect it to happen at this particular time frame. Let's see. It is particularly large this year. Some of the data I had in my notes here. Let's see. As of March 24th, more than 5,100 children, a record number, were in U.S. Customs and Border Protection custody. And apparently the conditions are not great. This kind of goes back to the children in cages thing. The Trump administration was not the one who made those detainee facilities. That was actually the Obama administration. I think the Trump administration used them a lot more, but the fact remains that was a pre-existing policy. And so now the Biden administration has kind of been getting heat from the political right in the United States because he's also kind of doing the same thing. I think the Biden administration wants to try to improve the living conditions for the people in the detainee facilities, but there's only so much they can do in such a short time frame. So I doubt that they're going to be able to change that anytime soon. It'll probably take a couple more months. In the meantime, they're going to continue getting heat for that. Oh, and the specific provision that the Trump administration was using to stop non-citizens from entering the U.S. was called Title 42. Apparently, that was part of the Public Health Safety Act. It, according to my notes here, it allows the U.S. government to temporarily block non-citizens from entering the U.S. when doing so is required in the interest of public health. So obviously they were using COVID-19 there as a reason to kind of stop that. Let's see, and since then, since the Trump administration started using that provision, more than 500,000 migrants have been expelled, including about 13,000 children. As it happens, the Biden administration has not reversed that. They're still using Title 42, just like the Trump administration did. But two of the things they're doing differently is that they've carved out 2 exceptions to that in order to let more refugees in. One of them is unaccompanied children, so they're being allowed in where they weren't before. And then they're also, oh, I mentioned this earlier, the people that had refugee applications, asylum applications, they had been being forced to stay in Mexico while their application was processed. Now those people are being let in. So those are the two exceptions that are being made to Title 42 here by the Biden administration. So by and large, it's kind of been more of a continuation of the Trump administration's immigration policy. But they've made exceptions and caveats here and there where they can in order to start moving away from it. It's probably just going to take some time in order to kind of really reverse the Trump administration's approach here. It was never something that the Biden administration was going to be able to do on a dime. But they are at least making the effort for the moment. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, I leave to the listeners to decide. I'm not here to kind of tell you what to believe, but this is kind of what I've read about this particular issue and what's been going on. I guess to be fair, that's more about the United States than Central America, but I don't have a whole lot of news on Central America specifically. Although I guess I did mention that President Hernandez's brother got arrested. I guess that's the main event that I would have in terms of recent news in Central America. Let's see. So let's see, we did Brazil, Central America. What else did we have? Argentina is still floundering, but it hasn't really been in the news lately. Very high inflation. I think inflation in Argentina is around 50% right now. It's fairly high. They're definitely not doing too well. The government's really kind of struggling to deal with the crisis. I was watching a video from I think Al Jazeera today about how expensive meat has gotten, which is pretty wild given that Argentina is one of the leading beef producers in the world. So you'd think it would be pretty cheap, but just because of all the inflation happening in the Argentine economy, it's gotten so expensive that a lot of people can't afford it. Apparently, the Argentine government is thinking about imposing price controls to try to deal with that, but that's not the best. That's not going to end well, probably. Price controls very rarely have very good long-term consequences.
Yeah, you mentioned Venezuela doing that for groceries and stuff.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons their economy imploded. Obviously, falling oil prices were the major contributor there, the most significant contributor, but price controls were also very detrimental. So Argentina, and in the short run, they can be useful. Like if there's just a temporary spike or something, it can be managed. But a lot of countries that implement them try to implement them for the long term, for political reasons, rather than for short-term economic reasons, and that's bad. I mean, just to put it mildly, it's textbook economics. You create shortages when you create price ceilings, and there's also negative repercussions if you put price floors even. So it's just very risky, and the suspicion is that if the Argentine government kind of moves forward with that, then they're going to crush the beef industry. It's not something that they haven't done before. I think about 10 years ago, they actually imposed export restrictions in order to try to make beef cheaper in Argentina, and also to generate revenue for the government. Argentina is always looking for money, pretty much. The Argentine government is that anyway. And export taxes, basically, were one of the ways they wanted to do that. But the result of that is that the price of meat did fall in Argentina, but that led a lot of producers to exit the market, and overall production fell, such that there were shortages. I think there were shortages. Maybe it's just that they got expensive again. But it has very detrimental economic impact if you don't do it right. And Argentina is not known for doing economic policy right, so there is some concern there. If we have any Argentines listening, please do contribute in chat. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what's going on in Argentina. I think we had one listed in our flag list here.
Viewer geolocation. Or at least one person with the Argentina VPN set up.
Let's see. So Argentina, Brazil, Central America. I guess Central America isn't really South America. I just kind of threw it in. Paraguay has been in the news. They're not generally in the news much. You don't hear about them much. But I think the most recent thing had to do with China. I think the Chinese government was kind of trying to push them into recognizing the PRC as the government of China instead of Taiwan. No, not that. It's they didn't want them to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. That's what it was. Paraguay is one of the few countries that had been recognizing Taiwan, so the Chinese government kind of pushed them to not do that. I don't quite remember what the carrot and stick they were offering was. I think they were just offering them development money or something. Yeah, other than that, the only other thing I can think of Paraguay was the cross-border banditry from Brazil that happened last year. They had some catchy name for that, New Conchago, something like that. Apparently there's like a name for old-timey banditry in Brazil. And there's been some very well-coordinated large bandit raids, weirdly. I think mostly targeting banks in Brazil, and one of them actually crossed the border into Paraguay.
Bandits, you say?
Bandits, yep. Pretty well funded. They had pretty nice vehicles, very well coordinated, well armed. Maybe thieves would be a more accurate term, but I think banditry is kind of what they call it down there.
Damn. Early game Civ mission time.
Pretty much. I feel like I'm forgetting something for Paraguay, but it's not coming, and it's not in my notes, so I'll have to let it slide. Chile, I think, delayed its constitutional thing. What is that? Constitutional convention. They're going to write a new constitution, but the process kind of got delayed by COVID. A public health crisis is not the best time to have a convention of any kind, so they ended up delaying when they would do that. So I think it should happen sometime this year, but it could be, I think it got delayed for later in the year rather than sooner. I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that when it happens, but for now, I don't think Chile's really been in the news a whole lot. Bolivia has had some drama that had to do with the, I don't know what to call it. Some people want to call it a coup, but I'm still not convinced it was a coup. That was like in early 2020 or late 2019. I don't quite remember, but basically Morales, the Chavista politician, president of Bolivia for a long time, tried to run for a third term, and a lot of people really didn't like it. So there was some mass protests after there was some allegations of electoral fraud, which may or may not have been substantive. I think the grounds for the accusation is that the Electoral Commission stopped reporting results I think at midnight or something on the night of the election. And then later on, the results came in and they were a little bit suspiciously different from where the last reporting had been, where the reporting had left off before they cut off reporting. So that kind of got people upset. But then there's some evidence that there were some conservative politicians who wanted to try to organize unrest in any case. So kind of, I don't know, you kind of have to that's kind of in the eye of the beholder. I don't think it was a coup because I think it was more popular. I don't think it was like a conspiracy per se. There was some planning going on, but I don't think it would have succeeded if there hadn't been a lot of sentiment in support of it. Regardless of what you want to call it, Morales ended up getting chucked out, and he ended up getting replaced by a conservative congressman named Inez. It's a female congressman, and she did some controversial things. There was some crackdowns on Chavistas who kind of started protesting against the new government. And there was also some targeted violence against supporters of the government, and some targeted the Justice Department kind of went after some of the politicians in the, I don't remember what it was called, Morales's party, the Chavista party. So there was some shady goings on there, and they ended up delaying the new election that they had promised that they would hold much sooner than they did. So that led some people to suspect that it was a right-wing junta that was never going to hold elections again. But as it happened, they did end up holding elections, and the conservatives lost pretty handily. Morales was not allowed to run again, which is probably for the best. A different guy, I don't have his name in front of me, but he was a Chavista and part of Morales' party. He won and became president. So the new drama in Bolivia has been the new Chavista government under the new guy targeting the conservative politicians that had been targeting them in the transition government over the past year. So a little tit for tat there. Doesn't say a whole lot for the health of liberal democracy in Bolivia, but Bolivian political culture has never really been known for being particularly healthy or stable, so probably not that big a surprise. I think the big question going forward is just how much power Morales will have over the new government. He's not technically in office, I think, in any capacity, but he has a lot of influence within the party. I think he's still basically the de facto head of the party. So that means he could have a lot of influence over the new president. But the new president says he's his own man and that he's not going to let Morales kind of run things from behind the scenes. So we'll kind of see how that pans out. I think it would probably be better if the new guy really was just independent. It's not really good for any political party to be too dependent on any one figure. And it's also not healthy for the political culture to be too focused on one guy either. It's kind of better to develop a healthy party system. But that may or may not happen, just depending on how things shake out. So that's kind of a wait and see thing. Let's see. So that's Bolivia. Peru is having elections. That's kind of messy. I haven't read up on that yet, though. I actually had a tab open with that, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. I think we've talked before about all the election drama in Peru lately. Past couple years, they've been kind of going through presidents like gangbusters. There was in 2020, there was actually a week where they had 3 different presidents in Peru. So that kind of gives you an idea of the degree of political instability they're dealing with.
It makes our President's Day look like weak shit.
Yeah, Peru is not all that bad off. Their economy is pretty decent, but they've just been going through a lot of political unrest the past couple years. That's kind of been making their politics a little shaky. Kind of comes down to corruption. That's partly fallout from the Odebrecht scandal. And it's also partly just kind of Peruvian political culture, which is more patronage-based. So a lot of politicians get into power promising big things, but they end up mostly focusing on just trying to distribute public goods to their supporters. And the result is that there's just sort of chronic corruption and instability. So that's what Peru's dealing with. Ecuador is holding elections. That's a little interesting because that's... I think the outgoing president, whom is not running again, was named... He had a cool name. It was like Lenin Moreno, I want to say. Something like that. His first name was Lenin, which I always thought was pretty interesting. Kind of gives you an idea as to his politics, or at least to his family politics. He kind of won. Well, he didn't really win, but there was a previous Chavista president named Correa, and he served his 2 terms but did not run for a 3rd term. The other Chavistas in South America could learn a thing or two. He didn't try to force a 3rd term, and Lenin Moreno was his successor. But his successor ended up being much less of an ideologue, and he actually tried to pass some reforms in order to kind of goose the economy a little bit down there. And Correa didn't like that, so they ended up fighting a power struggle within the Chavista party in Ecuador. And I don't think anybody kind of ended up winning per se, but there's still this split between the reformers under Moreno and sort of the old guard under Correa. So recently, the current presidential nominee for the party is actually a pro-Correa guy. So he's seen as being more of a sort of left-wing Chavista-style politician. And his principal opponent right now is a more conservative guy. I think he's actually a member of Opus Dei, if you can believe that. So he's more pro-business, conservative, etc. Pretty much what you would expect from a right-wing Latin American politician. And it's very close. from what I was reading. I think most likely the Chavista candidate will win. At least that was the implication. But it could end up being pretty close. One of the interesting things I read about it is that both candidates were relatively pro-American, which kind of surprised me. You know, the Chavista party in Ecuador has kind of been more anti-American. There was a big military base. It was not an American base, but it was like a big air base that the United States had access to. I don't remember what it was called exactly, but the U.S. used it for a lot of anti-drug enforcement activities, you know, that kind of thing. And the Ecuadorian government under Correa went out of its way to try to, well, successfully, they forced the United States to leave that base. You know, the U.S. no longer has access to it. And Correa also, I think, pulled Ecuador out of the Rio Treaty. So it's not part of the collective defense mechanism in the Western Hemisphere. So they're not particularly pro-American, but apparently they're not particularly, at least the current candidate anyway, is not particularly anti-American either. So that's some change there. Ecuador in general has been probably the best run Chavista state in Latin America. You know, Venezuela is obviously the poster child for how things go wrong when Chavista-style politics are kind of allowed to run amok. But Ecuador, in contrast, has actually done pretty well. You know, they've done the whole shtick about increasing social spending, using oil money to try to benefit the broader public, you know, successful socialist policies, you might say. And they've done it without breaking with the liberal democratic tradition in Ecuador, such as it is. It's actually it's actually pretty unstable in Ecuador historically. But in so much as it's been a liberal democracy, the Chavistas down there have not really challenged that or upset liberal democratic norms too much. So that puts them in stark contrast to the Maduro regime over in Venezuela, which obviously takes a very different tack. It also is better run than I think Nicaragua. You know, Nicaragua is much poorer. You know, they don't have the benefit of having a lot of oil money. But the government there under Ortega is much more populist. You know, it's kind of balances left-wing with right-wing policies. And it's not explicitly authoritarian in Nicaragua, but it kind of flirts with it. The government there flirts with it. I don't know how many people remember, but there were mass protests in Nicaragua in 2019, specifically because the government was seen as getting too authoritarian. It kind of fell out of the news because of COVID-19 in 2020. So, you know, nobody's really heard about it since. But that gives you an idea of how the government is run there. So Ecuador doesn't have that problem, you know. So Ecuador, Bolivia, you know, like I mentioned before, Bolivia's political culture is kind of a mess. So they're not the best barometer of any ideology or political party, just on that account. So just given that those are the other Chavista governments, Ecuador kind of easily comes out on top. Doesn't mean they don't have problems, but probably the best run. And that kind of illustrates that it is quite possible to have a socialist government in Latin America that can work. At least when the natives aren't angry at them. There's some big protests in Ecuador. Ecuador is one of the protest countries in 2019. There was a whole bunch of them. It was Native Americans in the Amazon were protesting against some of the oil policies, specifically the oil industry, which is mostly state-owned in Ecuador, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that also bled over into into the election they're running now, because I think native parties actually are doing really well, surprisingly so. So they could easily become a kingmaker in the legislature. But that's what's going on in Ecuador's election. I don't think it'll make too big a difference in like the broader regional politics. You know, I think whoever wins is probably going to be relatively okay with relations with the United States, and I don't think they're going to really rock the boat in terms of any of the regional crises or whatnot. So Ecuador is kind of a small country. They're not too active in terms of foreign policy. But it is an interesting election, just in so much as it illustrates what a relatively well-run Chavista government kind of looks like.
Terminology question.
Yep.
What is Chavista government? What does that mean?
That's kind of a catch-all term that refers to any government in Latin America that has policies that sort of reflect or well, basically policies that reflect the policies of the Venezuelan government under Chavez. Hugo Chavez was a left-wing populist leader who was president of Venezuela for a long time. He was pretty much president for life. He died of cancer, I think, 5 years ago or so. I don't remember exactly when. But his whole thing was using Venezuela's vast oil wealth to try to benefit the broader public. So he had more public spending programs, more subsidies for food, more spending on education, public transport, all that kind of stuff. So he was the first major left-wing government. His was the first major left-wing government in Latin America pretty much since Cuba. Nicaragua kind of sort of had one in the 80s under the Sandinistas, but the Civil War kind of stopped them from doing too much. And I think there was also an APRA government in Bolivia. In the, oh no, that's not Bolivia, Peru. Peru had a left-wing government in the 80s, but I don't think they did anything too radical. They kind of had an economic crisis at the time, so their hands were kind of tied budget-wise. But Venezuela, in contrast, had lots of oil wealth. So the Chavista government there, well, Chavez there, had a lot of money to work with. And so he was able to kind of show that a left-wing government in Latin America was quite possible. It was also one of the first left-wing governments to actually kind of survive in Latin America without being overthrown. Obviously the United States during the Cold War kind of allied with the political right in Latin America to try to prevent left-wing governments from coming to power. Or at least left-wing governments that were seen as too close to the communists. So it was a pretty significant change for the United States to just kind of let it slide, as it were. There are some allegations that the U.S. tried to help or at least encourage a coup against Chavez in the, I want to say late 90s? It was like 2000, the year 2000, something around there. There was a coup attempt against Chavez, but I don't think it actually succeeded. I think it did end up failing. I think if the United States had wanted to overthrow him, it definitely would have. I don't think that the United States, if it did help the coup, was really seriously invested in it. Because if it were, I assume it would have succeeded. But regardless, Chavez became the poster child for left-wing politics in Latin America after that, or at least in South America. And so different left-wing governments that came to power after his government kind of came to be referred to as Chavista governments, in so much as they were left-wing populist governments that kind of emulated the style of politics that Chavez pioneered. So Chavista just is kind of a catch-all term that refers to that. He's dead, so he's... it's not like a reference to him personally. Mm-hmm. It's just the style of politics that he represented.
He paved the way for it, and other people kind of followed that model.
Yeah. And, I don't want to overgeneralize, because it's not as though all of those... one of the phrases that's used to refer to that is the pink tide. In Latin America, there was kind of a pink tide of center-left to left-wing governments that took power all over the region. And different governments were elected on their own different platforms. Again, in Venezuela, it was mostly about the oil. Mm-hmm. But in Bolivia, it had more to do with Native American parties and Native American rights, because there's been a long-running division in Bolivia between Native Americans. Maybe I should call them the Huacha. Maybe I shouldn't try. It's like there's two major native ethnic groups in Bolivia, and they're actually their culture is still relatively intact, mm-hmm. as opposed to a lot of other native groups that are very small, or their culture has been watered down due to assimilation. The major ethnic groups in the Andes, in contrast, are relatively intact. So they form a coherent political group in Bolivia. And generally, they kind of compete with the landowning white elite who live in the lowlands in eastern Bolivia. So that's more where the left-wing populist politics in Bolivia are centered. It's more sort of native versus European. Mm-hmm. And then in Ecuador is similar to Venezuela in so much as it's more about the oil money. So kind of a similar evolution there to Venezuela. But in Nicaragua, the left-wing populism there is probably the most different from the populism in Venezuela. So it kind of only sort of kind of qualifies as Chavista. It's similar in so much as it's left-wing and it's populist, but beyond that, the similarities kind of end. but it's generally lumped in because they did similar things. They implemented similar populist policies. They broke with the U.S. security regime. They left the Rio Treaty and whatnot. So Nicaragua kind of gets thrown in with the rest of them. Cuba isn't really Chavista because it's kind of had its own communist government and communist political culture that it had already had well before Chavez came to power. So it's not technically Chavista, although it's definitely closely aligned with the Chavista governments in Latin America.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Hopefully that clears things up a bit.
The person who asked said, "I see, thank you." So I think you got it.
Oh, cool. Let's see what. So we did Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, Peru, Ecuador. Venezuela is Venezuela. I don't think there's really been any change there. I did read that they abandoned price controls in 2020. I haven't really followed up on that, but I would be interested to see if that's really helped with the economic crisis. I would assume that it would, but I'm curious about how much it would help. They kind of dug a pretty deep hole for themselves, but I think that would be a really interesting research question. How much do the ending of price ceilings in Venezuela help the economy? It should be an interesting case study. Oh, you know what? There were elections in Venezuela. I think that was in 2020, though. That's not a recent thing. The opposition boycotted the election, and so now the Chavista Party, I should really just learn the name of the party instead of just calling it Chavista. The Chavista Party basically just won all of the seats because the opposition boycotted. So now they're in total control of the General Assembly, that is to say, the legislature. And that's kind of a problem because the opposition's only toehold in power had been their control over the National Assembly. It didn't really mean much because the Venezuelan government convened a constitutional assembly, the representatives for which were elected in an election that was also boycotted by the opposition, as a result of which the Chavista Party controlled the entire constitutional assembly. And one of the first things the assembly did was to basically vote to take the power of the legislature away from the legislature. So in effect, the assembly became the new legislature, and the actual General Assembly was completely defanged, legally speaking. Obviously, the legislature didn't really agree with that, so they just kind of ignored it, and that resulted in this kind of weird dual government scenario in Venezuela over the past couple of years. But now, all of that is unnecessary because now the Chavista Party has pretty much all of the seats in the General Assembly, again, because of that boycott. So the opposition is pretty demoralized. It's very divided. It was never really able to come together coherently. And any pretense that the actual president of Venezuela is actually Guaido has been pretty much dispersed at this point. So opposition definitely on the run, and Chavista government now probably more powerful than it's been since Chavez was at the peak of his power and popularity. But I can't think of anything recent happening with Venezuela, and I don't know what approach the Biden administration is going to take with it. They may be pretty lazy and just kind of do basic drug enforcement stuff, because the Venezuelan government, or more specifically, people in the Venezuelan government, do have ties with the drug trade. So the Biden administration may just kind of focus on that aspect of the relationship rather than taking a more ambitious approach of trying to change the regime, like the Trump administration was half-assedly trying to do. But they may not either just completely ignore it either. So kind of a lazy middle path there. I don't think the Biden administration is looking for drama. That's kind of Biden's whole thing, is that he's sort of the middle path, mild candidate that wants to stabilize things. So I suspect his approach to Venezuela will be kind of bare bones human rights accusations, maybe some sanctions, and then DEA activity. What else was there? Colombia. Gosh, what's going on in Colombia these days? There was protests in Colombia in 2019. They were one of the big countries that saw a lot of protests at the time. I don't know that anything really came of them. Maybe we have somebody from Colombia who knows better than I do on that. In 2020, there were actually anti-police protests at the same time the United States was having them. I don't know if the United States was an inspiration or if it was just a coincidence, but the protests broke out, I think, after there was a particularly egregious case of police brutality, basically, that made the rounds on the internet. But other than that, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know anything recent that's been going on there. At least nothing that I can remember. I've seen some YouTube videos saying that it's a lot less violent than it used to be and that people shouldn't be afraid to go there. And I think there's some truth to that. It's the Civil War is technically over now. There's a peace deal between the government and FARC. So it's not nearly as dangerous as it used to be. And it's not really as important to the drug trade as it used to be either. I think Mexico kind of usurped them in that regard. There's certainly been some pretty decent economic growth. Still violence. I think there's been some violence targeting former members of FARC in particular, to the point that FARC has been complaining that the government hasn't really been honoring the terms of the peace deal, which could be a problem. But I don't think that's anything new, and I don't think anything has come of that since then. Yeah, that's all I can think for Colombia. And I don't even know what's going on in, like, Guyana and Suriname and that's sort of a northern South America there. That hasn't been in the news much. The last thing I remember about, I think it was Guyana, was they elected a murderer to be president. A guy who had been convicted of murder and had been in prison. He ran for office and won.
What?
We'll see what happens with that. Best of luck to them.
Got elected after being convicted of murder?
Yes.
Were they happy about the person they murdered?
I don't think so. I think it has more to do with patronage. He was the head of one of the major political coalitions there. So I think it's not so much an example of picking the guy that you think will be the best candidate. I think it was more an example of picking the guy who you think is more likely to give you patronage, to give you payments, government jobs, that kind of thing.
It sounds like the plot of Goodfellas.
Well, in a lot of developing countries with weak political democracy, with weak political systems, a lot of the times the political parties pretty much are tantamount to organized crime.
Basically, there's someone who everyone respects and is scared of in town, and if you do favors for this person, then they'll give you protection and also give you freedom to do whatever you want. And you get money.
Pretty much.
Oh.
It's a pretty cozy setup. We used to have a lot of it here in the U.S. Patronage politics are not alien to the United States. It just kind of disappeared over time as the country became more prosperous. People became more self-sufficient in terms of their jobs and wages, rather than depending on, government favors, as you like, from politicians.
Mm-hmm.
It never really fully went away, to be fair.
Well, yeah, we still have stuff like pork barrel spending, which is you have an idea, say someone wants to make some community or social change or structural change in the region, and they say, okay, well, let's write a bill for this. And then when they're writing the bill, they're like, oh, this guy wanted something, so I'm just going to put in a little bit of a couple lines here that's going to benefit this person, a couple lines that benefit that person. So it's more pen and paper corruption, I guess, than the more historical, like we're going to take somebody out corruption. Did you see that in the news
recently?
No, did that happen again?
Well, it actually has not been happening for about 10 years. One of the things that the Tea Party movement did back around 2011 or so is that they actually successfully barred pork barrel projects. They, as well as the Democratic Party, well, I should say the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in the Senate, both basically agreed not to introduce pork barrel projects into legislative bills. I think they're called earmarks. They promised not to use earmarks. Mm-hmm. So it actually hasn't really been a part of the political landscape for much of the past 10 years. But it's interesting you bring it up because they actually just brought it back.
Oh, shit. I was getting all excited.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was never something that was ensconced in law or anything. It was basically just a gentleman's agreement by the respective parties in the Senate and also the House to just not do it.
Hmm.
Both parties passed a rule basically within themselves to not do that. But one of the problems that was introduced by that is that it actually made legislating more difficult. Obviously, it created a lot of waste. But one of the upshots is that if somebody didn't want to vote for a bill that you wanted, you could just kind of buy them off with an earmark.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the downsides to getting rid of earmarks is that it actually made partisanship and partisan gridlock worse in Washington because it just got a lot harder to pass bills. There just wasn't as much lubricant, so to speak, that the politicians in Washington had to work with. Basically, it had to be basically to get people to vote for a bill, it had to explicitly be in their self-interest.
Yeah, it's way easier to get someone to vote for something if they benefit hugely financially.
Well, more specifically, their constituencies. A lot of the earmarks in question.
Right, but if their constituencies benefit, then they benefit in the intermediate or later term.
Yeah, I mean, there is some overlap with politicians themselves personally benefiting financially, and that's a whole other topic. But yeah, it's really more about just spending money in a given district, just to kind of give kind of boost the popularity of that district's representative. It gives them something to run on when they run for re-election. I got this money for our district. Never mind whether or not we need it or if it actually does anything. I brought home the bacon, so you should vote for me.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives some political capital for people, and it just makes the whole process of reaching an agreement and navigating political differences a little bit easier. So that's why that's why they're bringing back earmarks. Hopefully it doesn't go terribly wrong. They say that they're going to try to do it better this time. It's not as though they just brought back earmarks like they were before. I think there are some measures in place to try to prevent, the more egregious examples of corruption. Let me see if I can find the notes on that. I think I did write some of those down. We'll see if we get lucky. Nope. Pork? Nope. No dice.
Want some pork?
Huh?
You want some pork?
Yeah. Washington does. Yeah, it's somewhere in my notes, but I can't dig through it all here right now and find it. But yeah, there are supposedly, on the part of the respective parties, rules in place. I think one of them is reporting. Like, when they introduce an earmark, they have to explicitly label it as an earmark, which is not something they did before. Before, they would just kind of put it in the bill, and then we would read about it in the media, like, well after the bill had passed. Mm-hmm. But in this case, they're going to try to make it very apparent while the bill is still being negotiated what's an earmark and what's not. Still room for abuse, obviously, but hopefully they'll do it better, and hopefully the process of legislating is also made easier, because God knows we could use actual governance in the United States. Are we doing okay on time? I remember you said 2 hours.
Yeah, I just need to do a thing for an hour at the end of whenever we wrap up, because it has a time limit.
Gotcha.
So you could go for like another 15 if you wanted to wrap. Okay. I don't think we took questions today, but it was a really nice targeted conversation where we got a lot of South America and Central Asia, which is good because that was a goal for these moving forward, is to have something other than just a date. Because if it's just a date, then people are like, well, it's old news. But if you're talking more about what's been happening in a region over a longer term, then there's still a lot of value, and people know, like, they can learn some stuff about South America, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been drawing up more long-form notes. I've got a beast of a set of notes for Brexit that's been kind of unfolding still. Mm-hmm. I can kind of give you some of the highlights. There's been a lot of the burden of Brexit has really fallen on the fishing industry. It's kind of one of the more surprising outcomes. I would have thought the British government would go out of its way to try to make it easy on the fishing industry. I mean, they certainly went out of their way to make fishing rights and the rights to fishing waters and whatnot a big part of the negotiation. But apparently that did not extend to actually maintaining access to European markets. So as a result, the fishing industry in the UK has been really hammered. Let's see, and then there's also, yeah, just a lot of unexpected bureaucracy. I mean, actually, it was expected, but the private sector was not prepared for it. The British government really did a piss poor job of giving the private sector time to prepare for the new free trade deal that it signed with the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, that's just an inevitable result of the way the whole Brexit process has unwound. I mean, we've talked about that before. The British government was not expecting Brexit to actually pass. It was not expecting the referendum to go the way it did. And so it's kind of been operating on an extremely compressed schedule that has left it constantly on the back foot at every stage of the process. So really, if they'd done it right, they would have had a sort of phase-in period, a grace period, if you like, after they negotiated a new deal, when the government would go out of its way to prepare the private sector for all of the changes that would be coming, and then the private sector would be able to ease its way into the new status quo. As is, the British government was not able to do that, and instead it just kind of threw the whole British private sector right into the deep end of the pool. And not everybody's going to make it, or is making it. And, the big problem is just that there's a lot of new forms, red tape, just any clearances, like new taxes, just any kind of bureaucracy you can think of pretty much is now present, and they're all having to deal with it all at once, and it's being imposed all at once. There have been some areas where there are delays being made. The British government has announced a whole series of delays on some of their customs, which has resulted in the somewhat bizarre circumstance of the European Union enforcing customs on goods coming in from Britain and goods going to Britain, but the British government not imposing certain customs on its end. So it's kind of this weird asymmetrical status quo. It was probably inevitable. I mean, the British government just wasn't prepared for it, so they were always going to need time to adjust to it. So in effect, the delays kind of represent the time that should have gone to a grace period in an alternate universe where Brexit was actually well planned.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, they're having to learn the hard way. One of the examples I had here, I can't just go through all of them, but one of the examples had to do with return policies. The fashion industry in the UK, sells clothes, garments, whatever. And if you buy something you don't like, then you can return it. But one of the problems right now, because of all the turmoil at the border with all of the customs checks and customs bureaucracy, is that it might actually be cheaper for those companies to just burn stuff that gets returned, rather than to actually take it back and put it back on sale. And the problem is that when they sell stuff to a European buyer, when it gets to them, they're actually faced with an extra surcharge. It's actually a VAT tax, I think. It's an extra tax that they didn't have to pay for before for stuff that they bought from the UK. But now, after the free trade agreement has been imposed, they actually do. And what happens is that the people who, I think the couriers who bring them the good actually have to ask the customer to pay for that. And if the customer says no, because they weren't expecting the payment, a lot of people are saying no to the payment because they weren't expecting it. They thought that they had paid for it in full and that they just needed to receive it. But with the extra tax, a lot of people are actually rejecting the payment, and as a result, they're just returning the goods. So the problem is that when they return the goods, they have to navigate the whole cross-border bureaucracy again, and that actually makes it pretty expensive. So if a British firm has goods that are being returned from Europe, it's actually less expensive to just keep those goods in Europe. But a lot of them don't have branches in Europe to kind of sell those goods on or do something with them. So those goods are just sort of stranded in Europe for firms that don't have a European presence. And some of them are actually considering just burning them outright because it's cheaper. So that gives you an idea of how rough it is for small businesses in particular to try to navigate all the new bureaucracy on the border. There's also rioting in Northern Ireland. There's been rioting every night for the past week, apparently. Some of that has to do with just Northern Ireland politics. One of the problems I read was, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. I think it's pronounced Sinn Féin, basically the big Irish political party in Northern Ireland. also in Ireland, technically. A lot of their leaders went to a funeral of a leading Sinn Féin leader, and they did that against basically COVID measures. They weren't supposed to crowd together, and apparently a lot of the unionists in Northern Ireland really resented that. So there's some anger over that. There's also a lot of anger over the Irish border issue. Well, not the Irish sea border. One of the quirks, so to speak, of the Brexit agreement is that the United Kingdom has to treat Northern Ireland as though it's basically a different country, in terms of customs anyway. So there is technically customs checks on goods and services going from the UK into Northern Ireland and vice versa. And that's kind of upset some producers in Northern Ireland who are getting hit by the same customs problems that British producers are meeting when they try to export stuff to the European Union writ large. So there's some concern that the violence could spiral out and that there could be more time of trouble style problems in Northern Ireland going forward. That's probably exaggerated. It probably won't come to that. A lot of the it could just be hooliganism, pretty much. Younger people taking advantage of tensions to kind of riot and destroy. I think they destroyed a truck at one point, something like that. So maybe it's not all that substantive, but it doesn't bode well, and it definitely does not paint a pretty picture of the overall post-Brexit Britain that we've seen over the past couple months. I had a whole bunch of stuff on what the Biden administration's doing, but we don't have time for it. The Biden administration is really an interesting administration, historically speaking, because we find ourselves here. I mean, obviously, after 4 years of Trump, the U.S. political norms have been challenged. U.S. foreign policy has been challenged. There's a lot of open questions about how the United States moves on from that, or if it moves on from that. And then there was also pre-existing questions even before Trump came to office about the direction of U.S. politics and foreign policy, perhaps less dramatic, but U.S. foreign policy had kind of stalled out before Trump came in. There was just a lot of running problems that nobody had clear-cut solutions to, that there wasn't really much traction for dealing with. And similarly so for domestic political problems. There had been so much partisan gridlock that there was just a lot of problems that hadn't been addressed. So that's pretty much been the status for American politics for 10 years now. The past 10 years have really been a lost decade for the United States in a lot of ways. So the Biden administration is the first administration to have both a unified government and a desire, unlike the Trump administration, to kind of pursue traditional American political goals while adhering to traditional political norms. So that means upholding the traditional U.S. role in the world, pursuing traditional policy objectives in the United States and doing it in a traditional way. And so that leaves the Biden administration with a lot of room to maneuver to really kind of break this deadlock, this policy deadlock in the United States, and actually try to substantively address a lot of these problems. So whether or not they can actually do that is the big question, and how they do that is a big question. So I've been paying attention to that and accumulating notes about how the Biden administration is trying to address some of these big thorny problems in the United States. So I think it's turning into an interesting list. I think when we get to it, it'll be an interesting conversation, but it's just not quite ready yet. And I have to keep adding to it because, obviously, we're in a period of very active policymaking in the United States. We have a unified government for the first time in a couple of years, and they're really very aggressively. We talked before about how aggressively tackling policy issues is very much the Democratic Party's strategy here. So there's just lots of new items coming in that I'm having to add over time as I try to process the stuff that's already happened. So I'll try to have that ready as soon as possible so that we can talk about that. But yeah, just for now, the meta commentary there is that there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of interesting policy stuff happening in the United States right now for the first time in a long time.
By unified government, you mean there's control of the executive branch and the legislative branch at the same time?
Yeah, the Democrats have majority control in the Senate, in the House, and a Democrat controls the presidency. Doesn't mean they can do whatever they want, but they have a lot more ambit to do what they want now than they have in a very long time, probably since the Obama era back in 2010. So, like it or hate it, I'm not saying that it's a good or bad thing. I'm just saying that this is a pretty historical moment. And maybe he flubs it. Maybe the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress kind of flub the moment and they're not able to do much, but they're certainly trying one way or the other. So, whether you like what they're doing or you hate it, it's certainly a very interesting policy action we're seeing. And I think it's well worth talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So, hopefully, we'll get to that sooner rather than later. Gosh, a bunch of other stuff like Europe. The presidential election coming up in France is looking to be very close. It's probably going to be Macron versus Marine Le Pen, but it's no guarantee, and the field is actually pretty crowded, and it's getting closer there. So it may not even be Macron or Le Pen. But the best guess right now is that it's going to be Macron and Le Pen, and it's just looking very close. And Le Pen she's not far right per se. I'm sure some people would quibble with that, but her party started out far right and has tried to move more towards the center over time. But she's definitely a right-wing populist at the very least. So there is actually a decent chance that France could have a right-wing populist government this time next year. Well, maybe not this time next year, but sometime next year, which would have some pretty dramatic ramifications for European politics, if not broader global politics. Germany is trying to kind of figure out who's going to be the successor to Angela Merkel. I think the SPD, the left-wing party in Germany, already has their guy kind of sorted out, but the right-wing party, the CDU, is still trying to figure out who's going to succeed Merkel. I think the head of the party is definitely going to be Laschet. I think that's pretty much set in stone now. But it's not clear that he's going to be the guy that actually runs for chancellor and becomes the next leader of Germany. I guess it's not guaranteed they'll actually win the election. Regardless, it could be the SPD, and a coalition they lead could win the upcoming election, and then they have a left-wing government. But we'll see. It's a little too early to tell there. But regardless, the CDU is looking more and more like it's going to give the nod to what's his name here? Skoder? Is that what it was? Soder. Marcus Soder. We've talked a little bit about him before, but it's been a while. He's a Bavarian politician. He's a little bit unique as a Bavarian because he's not Catholic. Bavaria is I don't want to say nationalist, but it's very prideful. It's kind of it's a large province. It has a very long storied history. It's kind of like the Texas of Germany in a sense. Mm-hmm. They even have their own political party, the CSU. It always basically governs in coalition with the CDU, which is the larger national conservative party. But it just illustrates how unique Bavaria is that they have their own conservative party. They're not going to vote for the National Conservative Party. It has to be a Bavarian party. So Marcus Soder has been the governor of Bavaria. I believe he was governor anyway. But it's looking like the CDU might give him the nod to be chancellor if they win the upcoming election. And he's kind of a populist type politician. He's not a right-wing populist explicitly. But he has kind of pandered more towards the anti-immigration crowd in Germany. So it could be a rightward shift there if he does get into power. But again, too early to call. But it's interesting that is kind of the direction the CDU is going. Italy has a new government that had to do with a failed power play on the part of the Who's-Its. What was their name? No, that was something different. What happened is that the New Democratic Party, I think that's what it was, which was a coalition partner in the governing coalition, pulled out of the government and forced negotiations for a new coalition. And the result of that is that Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank, actually ended up prime minister. And that's a pretty significant development because that really pushes the government more in a conventional direction. Last year, up until last year, the Italian government was governed by a combination of a left-wing and a right-wing populist party, which is a very bizarre combination. And unsurprisingly, it didn't last very long. But when it imploded, the left-wing populist party, the Five Star Movement, allied with basically the mainstream center-left party in Italy. I think it's the Democratic Party or something like that. That coalition has been working decently since then, but then the drama with the New Democratic Party kind of upended that. But with the installing of the Mario Draghi as the prime minister, that's a really significant shift more towards a pro-European government than what they had even under the previous coalition government under the Democrats and Five Star. So that's a positive move if you're a Europhile. Italy's government had been looking like it might be moving away from the European for a while, but now it's looking like it's very much coming back. And it also, because Italy is relatively important within the European Union and European Union politics, the fact that they have Mario Draghi as the prime minister now also means that Italy is going to be a significant force for further, I don't want to say centralization, because that's very unpopular at this point in Europe, but he is going to be supporting more Europhile type policies, whereas Italy had very much before been in the Eurosceptic camp and had been holding up more European policies. I'm kind of struggling to describe that, but hopefully I'm making sense there. We'll see if he is able to stay in power when the next elections come up. That's not entirely clear. I think the Liga Norte, well, actually it's called Liga now. It's the right-wing populist party, had been looking like it would do pretty well in a new election, but then COVID happened, and that's kind of thrown into doubt a lot of the pre-existing political trends in Italy. So we'll see what happens there. And then we already talked about Russia. Yeah, I guess that's probably the 15 minutes he gave me. But just to run through some of the other stuff here really quickly, China's been liberalizing its financial sector, and that's resulted in a huge flood of money in there. We'll talk about the significance of that sometime. There's been some changes to the electoral system in Hong Kong that's made it more authoritarian. It's basically more like Iran now. We could talk more specifically about that later. Saudi Arabia has been responding to the Biden administration's renewed commitment to human rights. So that's led to the Saudis offering some basically conciliatory policies to try to pacify the United States. They've also got this really interesting mega project called NEOM. That could be something we talk about. There's actually a really cool YouTube video about that. I would recommend people checking out. It's a pretty neat project. It's probably not going to pan out the way they want. It's just a little too big and ambitious, but the technology involved and the ideas are really cool. So definitely something worth checking out. Iraq and the United States negotiated a troop withdrawal. So the United States is looking like it's going to pull out of Iraq. I don't think it's going to strategically withdraw from Iraq. I think we're still going to be working with the Iraqi government, but the actual troops that have been in Iraq are probably going to leave, or at least that's what it looks like right now. There's been drama in Jordan. There was a whole kerfuffle with a prince trying to overthrow the government, which is pretty dramatic. He failed pretty miserably, so it's not going to have any broader repercussions, but it doesn't really speak well to the stability of the royal family's control over the country there. More violence in Myanmar. There's just a lot of... The government there has taken the strategy, basically, of maximum violence. They're dealing with the protests just purely by trying to kill them into submission. And I was reading today about some government troops that were using grenade launchers on some of the protesters. So continued drama there, no surprise. Pakistan and India could be moving towards more peaceful relations. The Pakistani government has kind of moved away from its traditional confrontational stance with India. Whether or not that's a long-term policy change or more just a strategic thing they're doing in the short term is kind of open to question. I note that they have cotton shortages in Pakistan, and that's really hurting their textiles industry. They import a lot from India, so it kind of behooves them to be more friendly. So maybe that's more the impetus than any real long-term strategic change. But it's worth mentioning. It's some positive news in the region, and it's the first time Pakistan has signaled a desire to do anything like that in a long time, decades. We already talked about South America. Oh God, you're missing out, Neuro. We'll have to talk about it next time. But desks are being defiled in Australia.
Desks?
Desks. The poor desks, Neuro.
Who's attacking the desks?
Australian politicians, of course. I guess I should say staffers, technically, but yeah, government workers. The poor desks never saw it coming, Neuro, I tells ya.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a story. And then Japan has had some problems with its Olympic committee getting in trouble with not treating women very well. the phrase "fat pig" came up more than once. Let's put it like that. So we'll have to talk about that later as well.
Mm-hmm.
No, wait, not fat pig. Olympic. It was a play on words. Olympic. So that's all stuff we can get into later. That we'll have to get into later. But that's all stuff I thought was worth mentioning, at the very least.
Well, cool. Seems as though there's plenty going on in the world. Appreciate your expertise as usual.
Yeah, we're kind of moving out of the COVID cloud, as it were.
Yeah.
You know, COVID kind of pushed a lot of things back, and now history is kind of resuming. So we're probably going to have quite a bit to work with going forward. Good for me, but maybe not so good for a lot of other people.
Yeah, I don't know. I think people are happy to hear about other things too. A lot of people, I think, would be glad to hear that the issue is being resolved and we can move on to other issues. Doesn't mean that the world is fixed, but certainly it's less ill.
Certainly so.
Did we issue the usual disclaimer? Yes, I believe we did near the beginning.
Yeah, we got it early. I try to get it early. Sometimes I don't. I know I got it really late one time.
Oh, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, by the way. Yeah, I try to get it early in general. So I think I did today. But yeah, I'm sorry I missed the text message. I don't know why that didn't pop up more. But I'll try to keep an eye out for that. Did I miss one from you last week, by chance?
I don't believe so. I think last week I was either exhausted or I had something else that I was doing in the evening.
No problem. I'm paranoid about my phone. I'm always afraid that I missed a payment or something and that I can't get messages and don't know it. It's happened before. It's not an idle threat on the part of the phone company.
Yep. People want you to pay those bills.
Yeah, unfortunately so. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you, chat, for providing your questions and interest in hanging out for these. This one will be on YouTube. I just marked it here. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. See you next time.
GG.